everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Brace yourselves for another episode of Rock and Read. Today we will tackle Chapter 6 of My Life in the Eagles by Don Felder. Here we go. In August 1969, we heard through the Hippie Network that a big music festival was being held on a 600-acre dairy farm not far from Dover Plains. Billed as 3 days of peace and love, it was to be held at a place called Bethel near Woodstock. "Hey, we should go to this," I suggested to my roommate one morning after reading about it in a pamphlet someone had stuck under the windshield wiper of the van. "Just about everyone we know will be there. There's bound to be some guys coming up from New York and maybe even Florida. The lineup's incredible. Janis Joplin, the band, The Who, Jefferson Airplane, Joe Cocker, the Grateful Dead, even Hendrix is playing." "Awesome," replied Mike. "Okay, you organize it." Buried in the list of bands, I spotted Crosby, Stills and Nash, whose debut album, Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, was fast climbing the charts. Something told me that the life path of young Stephen Stills was going to keep crossing mine. I was right about everyone coming to Bethel. 500,000 people, actually. When we arrived in an old Chevy Suburban with a gang of friends from New York, it seemed like everyone was trying to get through the same 6-foot-wide gate we were aiming for. Among those in our convoy was Seasoned Hubley, the cute girl I'd fallen for when she came to Gainesville 2 years earlier. Sadly for me, she was with someone else, and wanting her to be with me instead of him marred my entire experience of the 3-day festival. I do remember that it rained, a lot. There was an incredible storm, which came rolling in from the east in great billowing clouds. The high winds nearly blew down the precarious speaker towers. We slept in sleeping bags in the Chevy, listening to the torrential rain drumming on the roof. Apart from when the storm was at its height, and all the electronics on stage had to be covered in plastic to keep them from shorting out, the music was non-stop. We'd lie in the back of the car, stoned out of our minds, waiting for the announcements for who was on next. "Oh man, I gotta see this," I'd say, and drag myself up, out of the car, into the rain. Sliding down the slippery hill toward the stage, I'd listen to Santana, Hendrix, or Alvin Lee playing until my ears felt like they were bleeding. It was a mud fest. Absolutely horrible, cold and wet. The sticky clay squelched up between our toes and found its way into every pore and crevice, but nobody seemed to care. Along with thousands of other people, I'd stand in the driving rain, swaying in time to the music before coming back to towel myself off and steam up the car windows until the caked mud finally dried. Woodstock was certainly an experience. Back in Dover Plains after the festival, life seemed somehow harder to bear. I'd known Stephen Stills as a kid, and there he had been at 4 in the morning on the same stage as some of the rock and roll greats, banging it out with the likes of Graham Nash, who I'd been so in awe of when he came to Gainesville with the Hollies. It had been only the second time Crosby, Stills, and Nash had played live together, and they were steaming. Stephen sat up on a stool in a blue and white poncho and sang with that distinctly gravelly voice of his. It was so groovy. I wanted to be up there alongside him more than anything in the world. Instead, I was bumming around some big old house in the sticks with a bunch of potheads, trying to salvage a situation I knew was fast becoming untenable. I felt completely isolated, physically and musically. We were miles from anywhere, and there were no girls or friends outside the band. Winter was coming, and we were broke. Nobody seemed to understand that we were going to freeze to death in that huge, heatless house unless we did something about it. Winter came, and with it, the snow. It was like nothing I'd ever seen in my life. We had had sprinklings in Boston and New York, but this was so deep, it banked up against the front door, soft and fine like powder. It smelled of steel. To begin with, it was fun, having snowball fights and fooling around. Once the novelty had worn off, however, the snow brought further isolation to the already strained situation. Unable to escape, we were trapped inside together, day in and day out, and the tensions between us became less easy to hide. Those bitter few months reminded me of my final year in my parents' home, and I was sorry for the bad feeling I had created. One day, that winter, I sat down at a desk I had built out of old lumber that was lying around in the yard. Taking a pen and paper, I wrote my mother a letter, telling her where I was and that I was okay. Thank you for all the years you raised me under harsh conditions, I said, and for all you taught me. I even thanked her for dragging me to church by my ear. I sent the letter off with my address on the envelope. It was my first contact with my parents in 2 years, and a letter came back by return mail. Dear Don, she wrote, how wonderful to hear from you. I've been worried sick. Thus began a correspondence that continued with her for many years. My father never wrote a word. I began to realize that my dreams of musical stardom were probably pie in the sky. It was post-Vietnam me-decade, but things certainly weren't happening for me. Our only regular gig was at Goddard College in Plainfield, Vermont, a progressive liberal arts place a few hundred miles north. We saw Carlos Santana playing Black Magic Woman there, a huge hit at the time. Arlo Guthrie was a music student at the college, and they had a gamelan band, an Indonesian percussion orchestra. Driving up to Goddard one day on the way to another gig, I succumbed to a sudden, compelling urge. Pulling the van over at a payphone, I fumbled for some change and dialed the number of Susan's family home in Boston, memorized for all time. Hey, Mrs. Pickersgill, it's Don Felder from Gainesville. Is Susan there? Hello, Don. My, it's been a while. No, dear, she doesn't live here anymore. She's found a place of her own. Would you like her number? Susan was very surprised to hear from me. It had been 18 months since we'd last seen each other. She had just broken up with her latest boyfriend, a singer-slash-guitarist, and was working as a secretary at the Harvard History Research Center. We chatted until my money ran out, and I told her I'd call again. A week later, I did. Then again the week after that. It felt good to talk to someone who wasn't stoned out of their mind all the time. She had a good job in her own apartment, something I couldn't possibly have afforded. I was impressed. A couple of weeks later, Susan told me she'd be staying at her sister's house in Skooate on Cape Cod babysitting. Do you want to come out? She asked. We could get to know each other again. Looking around me at the mess of the life I was living, I jumped at the chance. By the end of the weekend on that beautiful Atlantic shore, she and I realized how much we still loved each other. It felt like coming home. For the next couple of months, Susan and I commuted back and forth between Boston and Dover Plains every weekend, making up for the lost time. To begin with, she was enamored of the bohemian life I was leading, living in this old colonial mansion with a band that had just cut a record, existing on a diet of zucchini sandwiches. But after a while, the veneer wore off, and she could see all the ugliness underneath, especially with the drug abuse. When Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin died separate drug-related deaths that fall, I felt as I had when JFK had been killed, shocked and a little afraid. I had seen both of them perform at Woodstock less than a year earlier. Now they were gone, cold in their graves, and their future promise had died with them. Through Susan's eyes, I came to have a new and even unhappier appreciation of where my life was headed unless I broke away from those influences. I knew it was only a matter of time before Flo and I parted company. Come to Boston, Susan urged. You can move into my apartment and look for a job. There's bound to be some session work or a band that needs a guitarist. I knew she was right, but it took me a couple of weeks to get up the courage. After all, wasn't I leaving our Woodstock dream behind? Hadn't I told Bernie this was probably the best chance we had at success? Where had it all gone wrong? When the dirt, apathy, and lethargy finally became too much, I called up Creed Taylor. Hey, Creed, it's Don Felder of Flo, I said. I just want to tell you that I've decided to quit the band. It's not really working for me, and I need to leave. Creed didn't seem at all surprised, and he said he understood. Where are you headed? He asked. Boston, I said. My girlfriend works at Harvard. Great, he replied. Well, listen, I know some people in Boston. In fact, I'm on the board at the Berklee College of Music. If you want, I'll call them and see if I can get you in. I was both surprised by and grateful for his kindness. Oh, okay, I said, only I hadn't thought about going back to studying right now. I really need to make some money. Creed laughed. I didn't mean as a student, Don. I meant as a teacher. You have a great deal you could offer, you know. Despite his apparent confidence in me, I wasn't quite ready to shave off my beard, cut my hair, and become part of the Boston teaching establishment. Thanks anyway, I said, smiling inwardly at the thought of wearing corduroy and tweeds and telling kids how to play guitar. I'll keep your offer in mind, but first, I think I want to try and find another band. My fellow musicians were not at all happy with my decision to leave. They saw it as a sellout. What do you mean you're leaving? Mike gasped when I told him. We're just about to make it to the big time. You think so? I asked scathingly, looking around at the mess of a house we shared. Nobody had done any serious playing or songwriting in months. Or are we just on the brink of almost getting ready to start thinking about maybe writing some songs for possibly another album? Get real, Mike. This ain't gonna happen. The band's unhappiness quickly became focused around their only means of transport. If you go, you're leaving that van here, John told me. We're not gonna be stuck out here without any wheels. Yeah, said Chuck, turning on me in the kitchen, and you can leave that guitar Gene gave you as well. I'm not leaving the van if it's still registered in my name, I told him adamantly, backing away. If you guys default on the payments, I'll have a bad credit rating for the rest of my life. To my horror, Chuck lunged at me, but Mike pulled him off. Hey man, let's not get crazy here, he yelled. We can work this out. With far more rancor than was necessary, the paperwork for the van was eventually signed over to Andy Leo, and I was permitted to leave. I packed my things and walked out of that house, past the rest of the band standing silently on the front porch, watching me. They had agreed I could drive the van as far as Boston to offload my stuff, but Chuck, accompanying me as insurance, would drive it home. I looked back as we pulled out of the sweeping gravel drive and wished the ending could have been happier. Where did all the peace, love, and happiness go? I asked Chuck. He was too high and angry to answer. Boston was another world. Susan and I were very happy living in our little basement apartment on Commonwealth Avenue, but at first I found it hard being back in a city without a band to play in. It was 1970, the year the Beatles broke up, and no matter how relieved I was to be away from Flo, I couldn't help but feel as if I too had lost my way. I took on any musical job to make ends meet, even playing movie themes on a nylon string guitar during the 6 to 9 dinner gig at the Holiday Inn in Harvard Square. Mostly, I didn't even know the songs I was asked to play. Some guy would come up and say, "Hey, it's our anniversary. Can you play my wife's favorite song? It's The Shadow of Your Smile. She just loves it." "Sure," I'd reply, grinning inanely, "after my next break." My break would then be spent in my dressing room, a grubby corner of the hotel kitchen right next to where they peeled potatoes, poring over a fake book of songs and movie themes, learning the chords and practicing them so that when I emerged, 20 minutes later, I was able to play it as if I knew it perfectly and earn my $5 tip. Painfully aware that this was not what I had planned as a career, I tried to get in touch with as many musicians as I could, but Boston was hardly the hub of the musical universe, and there wasn't much work around. I did meet up with some interesting people, though. One was an eccentric Englishman named Peter Green, who had recently given away most of his money and left the band that had made him famous, Fleetwood Mac. I met him while jamming at a free concert in the park. We got to chatting, and I discovered that he had just arrived in town and had nowhere to stay. "You can stay at my place for a while if you like," I told him. There was something about his eyes that made me trust him. He came home and slept on our couch for a few days. We jammed together quite a bit. He was a great blues guitarist. He had a broad Cockney accent and a wicked sense of humor. We even discovered that we shared a passion for B.B. King, but he took far too many mind-altering substances for my liking, and then one day he just disappeared, so nothing ever came out of our collaboration. I heard later that he had gotten religion in a big way and given the rest of his money to charity. I found a job for $50 a week at a cut-rate recording studio called Triple A. My job was to hire the session musicians for recordings, many of them students of the Berklee College of Music. One was Abraham Abe Laboriel, who has since become one of the most noted session bass players in jazz and pop. As soon as he started playing, everyone perked up. His feel for rhythm was unbelievable. Abe and I became friends, and I hired him as often as I could. Joe, the owner of the studio, ran it like clockwork. He was a master at persuading people they could have a singing career, even though he knew a dog might sing better. He placed ads in the newspaper looking for new singers, and anyone would respond, from bored housewives to the man who drove the downtown bus. He'd convince every one of them they were the new Streisand or Sinatra, and that their best chance of success was to make a solo album with him. They'd walk out of there floating on the dream that he was going to make them a star. I had 2 other jobs on evenings and weekends in separate studios writing jingles for car dealers and clothing outlets. I'd play guitar and a little bit of piano or drums, and a jingle singer would make up a lyric for my track. One of the studios was called Ace, and the older son, a kid named Shelly Yakis, used to come in and sweep up, roll the cables, and watch what I did. Now he's one of the premier engineers in the business, making Bruce Springsteen and U2 records, no less. I bumped into him years later and we recognized each other right away. I worked day and night but made practically no money. I did session work all day and played rhythm and blues in a club from 9 till 2. It wasn't much of a life, not least because I was never home with Susan. I was seriously beginning to wonder about resurrecting my first job as a music teacher or even doing something completely different. I don't know where the idea came from, maybe from my difficult relationship with my father, but I started taking classes in child psychology at Boston University. It wasn't easy going back to school, but my brother Jerry, whom I had had little or no contact, heard from my mother what I was doing and out of the blue sent me a check for $500. Thought you might need this to help you through the next few months, he wrote. I know how tough it can be as a student. I will never forget this loving gesture. I called and thanked him with all the grace I could muster, and promised I would repay him one day. I did, many years later, having worked out the interest he'd have earned on the money he lent me. But he sent the check back, with a note saying he was proud to have invested in my career. Aw, bro goals. Bernie came into town every now and again, and I was always pleased to see him. He had been in Linda Ronstadt's backup band for a while, but his biggest break was joining a group called the Flying Burrito Brothers, headed by Graham Parsons. They had already recorded one successful album and were on the East Coast as part of a nationwide tour. Susan and I went to see them in concert, and they were great. You gotta get out of here, man, Bernie told me when he went back to his hotel after the show. You can do better than writing car jingles. You're a great guitar player, Don. You gotta come west. Susan's face told me all I needed to know. She was from Boston. She loved being near her family, and if I wanted to stay with her, then Boston was where I'd have to remain. I found this great little duplex in a house in Hingham, honey, she told me one wintry night in January 1971. It's right near where I grew up. I don't know, I said. I'm not sure how much longer I can keep on working at this pace, and I don't really want to move away from central Boston and take on any extra rent. She looked up at me with those big blue eyes of hers, and I couldn't resist. Okay, I agreed, if that's what you want. Susan's mother, who had always liked me and had been nothing but friendly, suddenly decided that this was a step too far. Hingham was a smart suburb of Boston, 15 miles south on the coast, and more important, she still lived there. You're not moving back to your hometown to live in sin, she told Susan in horror when we gave her the news. Either you get married and live respectfully, or you can find somewhere else to live. We had already seen the duplex and agreed to take it. We had also given notice on our old apartment. It was bitterly cold and snowing outside, and I knew it was unlikely that we'd find anywhere as nice for the money at that time of year. Saying nothing, I borrowed $5 from Susan and went to a jewelry store near Harvard. When she came home from work later that night, I pulled a small engagement ring from my pocket and blurted out, "Will you marry me?" "Yes, of course I will, you dope," was her laughing reply. It was very unromantic, not at all what she or I had expected. It felt like we were just pleasing her mother. To this day, I'm not sure if Susan and Miss Pickersgill cooked up the whole thing as part of a double conspiracy to get me to do the decent thing. Either way, it worked, and I never regretted it. The wedding was planned for April 23rd, 1971. My parents, whom I hadn't seen since I had left home, were going to drive up from Gainesville with my brother Jerry, whom I invited to be my best man. They would be just about the only people on my side of the church. Bernie couldn't make it because he was on tour, and I'd lost touch with most of my old friends from Gainesville, whereas Susan would have almost 100 guests. My father pulled up outside our old apartment in a white four-door Oldsmobile, for which he had traded the green Pontiac. I stood there with shoulder-length hair, mutton chops, and a mustache, feeling like a bashful kid as he came around to the sidewalk to greet me. At that exact moment, two of the most overt homosexuals I had ever seen, one in red-hot pants and high heels, with his arm around the other's waist, walked between the two of us. I had never seen them before in my life, and I thought my father's jaw was going to hit the curb. I started to say, "Welcome to Boston, Dad." Dad? I could see his mind was reeling. All his worst nightmares were coming true. To his credit, he chose not to comment, although I noted that he didn't take my outstretched hand. We ushered them into our studio apartment, with the bed in the corner, a rickety table and two chairs in the little bay window, a shabby couch, a small kitchenette, and a tiny bathroom. Susan put on a pot of coffee. Mom made all the right noises and was very excited about the wedding and helping Susan and her mother prepare for it. Dad wasn't hostile, just indifferent. and we certainly never discussed what had happened the last time we had seen each other. "You making enough?" he asked, looking around our home as if he had an unpleasant smell under his nose. "Yep," I replied uneasily. "Good." He seemed happy for me in his own way, but I could sense that, while he wholeheartedly approved of Susan and this marriage, he still thoroughly disapproved of me. The wedding was to be in a historic church north of Boston that Susan's mother wanted us to get married in. My parents stayed in a cheap hotel somewhere nearby. Susan was going to wear her grandmother's wedding gown, which was 100 years old, and which her mother had worn. Her ensemble was to be topped by a large white lacy hat. Since I didn't own a suit, and jeans and t-shirts were apparently not permitted, I was dragged off by Jerry and Susan's brother Bill to a discount store to buy a double-breasted gray pinstripe suit and some decent shoes. I never wore either again. At the ceremony itself, I was far less nervous. We even managed to recite our own vows. We thought that was pretty cool. The reception was in a nearby country club with a half-decent high school band banging away in a corner. "Just don't play Louie Louie," I told them. Hearing the song I had played 100 times on Daytona Beach would have been too depressing. The women of the Pickersgill family made all the food and the wedding cake, which we ceremonially cut before fleeing in our car in a rusty white 1965 Volvo with 120,000 miles on the odometer. Susan's brother-in-law Bobby had decorated with shaving cream and tied cans and streams of paper to the rear bumper. Dad shook my hand just before we left. "Well, you've got responsibilities now, Don," he told me sternly. "Make sure you live up to them." Mom cried as we hugged goodbye, and she made me promise to come visit. Jerry wished me all the best, and I thanked them for coming. We went back to our new home in Hingham, and I carried Susan over the threshold. "Where's the wedding certificate?" I asked her once we were inside. "Why?" she asked, handing it to me from her purse. Before she could say anything, I pulled a hammer and a nail from my toolbox and pinned that certificate to the bedroom door so that nobody could question us further. "It's official," I told her. "We're respectable enough to live here." At the age of 23, I was somebody's husband. The responsibility seemed awesome. We didn't have very much money, but we were young, in love, and living in half a house next to a graveyard. Life suddenly seemed sweet. From the local dog pound, we rescued a white German Shepherd mix with huge floppy ears. We called him Kilo after a kilo of weed. He guarded the apartment while we went out to work each day, and he kept Susan company while I played the clubs at night. Susan never minded having to be the main breadwinner, bringing home a steady wage while I bummed around town, doing session work and running in and out of studios, looking for more employment. With Bernie's amazing versatility in mind, I was constantly trying to improve my musical skills to increase my commercial worth. Using the equipment available to me, I taught myself rudimentary drums, keyboards, and bass guitar, and I learned how to mix tracks and overdub them. I couldn't give up my day job to pay for any of my new instruments, but I could get by. I just wished I could find something worthwhile to do with my new skills. "You're a musician, Don," Susan would tell me matter-of-factly, making me coffee when I got in late and tired from a club. "What else can you do?" Despite my intense personal happiness, I couldn't help but feel that I had somehow missed the boat. That feeling was compounded when John Winter, the former keyboard player and saxophonist from Flo, called up and asked if he could come and stay. He had just been released from a mental institution in New York State after suffering some drug-related emotional problems, and he needed a place to crash until his mother and sister could take care of him. I was shocked by his appearance. He seemed like a shell of the gifted young man he had once been. I called up his family to let them know he was safe, and we looked after him and gave him some money. "Do you hear anything of the other guys?" I asked. "Not much," he said glumly. "All I know is that Mike Burnett moved to Woodstock and spends his time drawing and taking drugs. Andy Leo's living in a hippie commune in Hawaii. There, but for the grace of God," I thought. Bernie, meanwhile, was going from strength to strength with the Flying Burrito Brothers. Stephen Stills was an established rock star with a million-selling solo album featuring Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, and Ringo Starr, and the Allman Brothers were flying incredibly high. Then, that fall, Duane Allman was killed in a motorcycle accident in Georgia. The band had just recorded its classic album at Fillmore East and was halfway through the next, Eat a Peach. The news came as a terrible blow to those of us who had known and loved Duane. Ripples of shock passed through the music community. Eric Clapton announced that, like me, he had been inspired to play slide guitar after listening to Duane Allman play. Duane had been a huge part of Layla and other assorted love songs by Derek and the Dominoes, and was on fire during the whole album. He played slide live with every note in tune, which is really hard to do. When I first heard it, I thought, oh my lord, Clapton is God, but Duane is the second God, and this is too much. Every time I heard that distinctive guitar sound, I still think of him. Duane was the same age as me. I feel like we had grown up together. He taught me so much. Close your eyes and listen to the music, man, he once told me. Feel it in your heart, and when your spine tingles, you'll know it's right. It hurt like a physical pain to think I'd never hear him play again. The following summer, Stephen Stills came to Boston. Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young had split for a while as part of their ongoing development, and Stephen had set up a new band called Manassas with a great pedal steel guitarist named Al Perkins and Bernie's friend Chris Hillman from the Flying Burrito Brothers. I was very excited at the prospect of seeing Stephen again and went along to the gig to hear him play. He was great. He still had that distinctive voice and the ability to bang it out with great gusto. The band was really tight and the show impressive. High on adrenaline and music, I wandered backstage. There was so much we had to catch up on. I wondered if he'd remember our mad night in Pawtucket drinking Jack Daniels and bouncing on the bed, or whether he was still in touch with Jeff, the drummer from the Continentals. A gorilla in a security jacket stopped me in my tracks. "What do you want?" he growled. "Oh, I need to speak with Stephen Stills." "Why?" "I'm an old friend of his," I grinned. He looked highly skeptical. "We were in a band together in Florida." Still no sign of movement. "Listen, just go tell him Don Felder would like to see him, okay?" After much persuasion, the guard did as I asked. I stood waiting by the door along with a few other hopefuls, confident that at any minute my messenger would return with an apology and a backstage pass. Finally, he came shuffling back to his post, his face blank as it had been before. He didn't say a word. "Well?" I asked, impatient now. "Well, nothing," the ape said. "Mr. Stills is too busy to see you right now." I sank to an all-time low over the next few months, and I began to wonder if my father was right. I was married, nearly 25, and if I hadn't made it by now, I probably never would. Maybe there was no future for me in music, and maybe I should have gone to college as Dad had always wanted. At least I'd have had something to fall back on. Then a friend of mine I had met in New York, a great electric bass player, called me up one day. "Hey, Don, I'm in Boston," he told me on the telephone. "I'm opening for Delaney and Bonnie. You know, that husband and wife band who worked with Clapton and George Harrison? Why not come and hear us? We're playing at the college campus." I was impressed. Delaney Bramwood and his wife Bonnie had been linked with some pretty legendary names in the music business, and although they hadn't done so well since Clapton left the fold, I was still interested to hear their unique mix of vocals, brass, and percussion. At my friend's request, I arrived a little early and went backstage to jam with him first. I found him sitting with the bass player from the band, who was softly strumming to himself on an old Gibson. At the same time, I spotted an electric guitar leaning up against a wall. "Mind if I join in?" I asked. "Not at all." I was so used to sitting and jamming with musicians in the studios, I thought nothing of picking up that guitar and starting to play with this man I had never met before. I was fearless like that. There was really nothing anyone could throw at me that I couldn't deal with. I figured I had nothing to lose other than somebody grabbing me by the seat of my pants and throwing me out the door. The bass player could play very well, and we had a good time. One by one, the other band members drifted into the dressing room, drawn by the music. After a while, somebody lit a joint, someone else opened a few beers, and we kept on having fun. "Hey," Delaney finally said when we came to a natural conclusion, and everybody broke into spontaneous applause, "why don't you come out and sit with us on stage tonight?" "What?" I said, amazed. "Yeah, come on, it'll be fun," his wife added. She was a pretty pixie of a woman with short blonde hair. "Oh, okay, sure," I said, smiling and shrugging my shoulders. Later that night, I was introduced as Delaney and Bonnie's new discovery, and brought out to play blues with them. It was a great gig, really spontaneous and fun, like the best days of Flow, and it did a lot to lift my spirits. Music was what I was good at, I reminded myself. From my earliest days playing Chet Atkins in my bedroom, I had never been happier than when I was playing my guitar, and it was never better than this. After the show, the band surprised me by inviting me to go out on the road with them. "When?" I asked, suddenly excited by the prospect. If touring with them for a couple of weeks was half as enjoyable as the gig, then I couldn't see why not. I was sure Susan wouldn't mind me being gone for a while, and I could probably get some time off from the studios. Tomorrow morning, they replied brightly. We're leaving on the bus at 4 a.m. for a 3-month nationwide tour. My heart sank. I knew I couldn't leave on such short notice, and 3 months was much longer than I could bear to be apart from Susan. Sorry, guys, I said, shaking my head sadly. I'm married. I have responsibilities. I just can't do it. Clearly dismayed, they told me they understood, and for the second time in my life, I watched a great opportunity slip through my guitar-playing fingers. That's the end of Chapter 6. Let me know what you guys thought of Chapter 6 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.